Being uncomfortably aware of the way the Tyranid goo we'd landed in was reforming, we didn't waste any time sitting around boggling at the fact that we were still alive. The cargo cart was ditched, and we squeezed past the armsman to lift the door, where the white-haired engineer informed us that it wasn't quite ready yet. Sarge drew a breath and got ready to scream at the geezer about our impending deaths at the claws of a swarm of reanimating warp bugs, but deflated when Tink, who knew the engineer, quietly explained that it would only result in a lecture about young people and their myriad failings. Left with a lot of unspent rage, Sarge began pouring pulse fire into the surrounding ghost nids and yelled at us to get off our asses and do the same. We all stepped up to help Sarge and the armsman play whack-a-bug, except for the few of us who had more useful things to do. Tink jumped off his driver's seat on the pallet, grabbed the replacement batteries from the practically catatonic tech acolyte, and began replacing the nearly expended ones powering the Demonthrope's stasis unit and the suppressors. Doc attempted to patch the defensive wounds that Amy had acquired when the Gaunt had landed on her, but got told to go fondle someone who didn't have shooting to do, and switched his attention to a badly wounded armsman. Theo held the small, towish device he'd been fiddling with up to the busted suppressor, and declared his genius as the dead bugs around us stopped reforming and began to drift apart. The armsman cheered as the ghost nid advance slowed, and so did we when the engineer whacked the door control a few times with a spanner and it began to grind open. No one noticed when one of the tendrils of smoke rising from where the Demonthrope's wings intersected the stasis field twisted towards the Vox system set in the bay's ceiling. At least, not until the Vox began screeching with a high-pitched chittering sound. Now, an uneducated plebeian might have mistaken the sound coming from the Vox for mindless Tyranid chattering, but we immediately identified it as binary, and an attempt by the Demonthrope to control any nearby servitors, servoskulls, and cogboys. A guardsman's senses are just that precise. Well, no, actually they aren't, but it was sort of obvious after the tech acolyte smashed the psi suppressor Theo had just fixed. As usual, Twitch was the first to respond, even if he was actually operating under the assumption that the Mechanicus had allied with the Demonids, and possibly the Orcs all along. And this was just the first stage of their uprising against the divine light of the Emperor. Luckily, we sorted that out for him before we ran into Jim or Hannah again, and even more luckily, for the tech acolyte at least, Twitch couldn't get a line of sight past our panicking Tau scientist. So instead of blowing off the hapless tech acolyte's head, Twitch opened fire on the engineer's 2 servoskulls, taking them down before they could do any damage to the pallet. The engineer responded by throwing his spanner at Twitch, but it only bounced off his helmet and the man apologized later, so there were no hard feelings. The rest of us took a little longer than Twitch to react, which meant that the tech acolyte had time to damage another psi suppressor before Tink brained him with a battery. As the second suppressor failed, a shipquake shook the bay, and the dead ghost nids stopped dissipating and began to flow together into large piles. When the first Tyranid warrior emerged from the goo and began hosing the barricades with Death Spitter rounds, we decided that it was really time we got moving again, and sprinted for the open lift. Actually, it wasn't a unanimous decision, as most of our retreats were. Doc had become rather fixated on the armsman he was treating, and wound up dragging the partially disemboweled man along with us onto the lift. Also, as we ran by the half-conscious acolyte, Twitch raised the possibility of continued Demonthrope possession and lift sabotage, and suggested that blowing the cogboy's head off was the only way to be sure. Nubby ended the ethical debate before it started by kicking the tech acolyte into the floor hatch the engineer had opened as an escape route for himself and the armsman. Judging by the crashes and bangs, the maintenance shaft went down 3 or 4 levels, but cogboys tend to be fairly sturdy, and he looked fine when we saw him again a few weeks later, though possibly that had been some other tech acolyte who was terrified of us and had an impressive collection of ladder-rung-shaped dents. Once aboard the lift, we shut the door on the deteriorating situation in the cargo bay and began our slow ascent to the main cargo corridor. Our ride was accompanied by the sound of thousands of ghost nids clawing at the shaft's doors, and this was made even worse by the mixture of cheery music and demonic screeches playing over the lift's speakers. Those of us who weren't attempting to save arbitrarily acquired armsmen, repair the damaged suppressors, or calm the cogitator adept for a sitrep, scanned the shaft above us and tried to anticipate when the first breakthrough would occur. It was a very high-stress situation, especially after Sarge learned that the checkpoint at the top of the lift was under heavy attack, which is why several of us reflexively started shooting the walls when the lift suddenly stopped and the lights went out. There were a few seconds of wild panic, and then Tink and Theo got the wide-angle illuminators on their drones activated, and we realized a few things. Firstly, the sound of angry Tyranids clawing at the shaft had vanished, as had the reassuring background noise of our comm beads and the humming buzz of the overloaded psi suppressors, but not the annoying lift music. Secondly, the shaft walls were bleeding, and it was human blood instead of Tyranid ichor for a change. Also, the tormented-looking faces that occasionally pressed out of the gore, then faded again, didn't look insectoid either. Finally, and most worryingly, to those of us who knew the occurrence border's foibles, the level we'd stalled at didn't have a cargo bay-sized door. Just an ordinary-looking hatch. Oh, and Doc's armsman was dead, but that probably had more to do with the cantaloupe-sized hole in his gut than anything eldritch. Theo, after verifying that the psi suppressors were still functioning, just not being overloaded for a change, jumped at the chance to do some repairs, and completely ignored the totally normal door. The rest of us gathered around it and held a completely silent debate, which ended with our fearless leader stepping forward to open it while we got ready to blow apart whatever horrors waited on the other side. As the door swung open, we all lowered our weapons. Twitch whimpered. Amy and Doc swore. Tink set Spot to record. Sarge facepalmed, and Nubby cheerily waved at the smoldering, bearded skeleton at the head of the poker table, who laughed and waved back. Our arrival didn't go unnoticed by the other players at the poker table. The charred skeleton with a chainsword at his side turned and waved as well, and the exit wound-faced man on the far side raised his beer to us before messily dumping it into the approximate area of his mouth. This caught the attention of the last man at the table, a massive, angry-looking fellow in scout armor, who looked surprisingly normal if you ignored the telephone pole-sized Tyranid talon lodged in his chest. He turned towards the door, knocking drinks and chips everywhere with his chest talon, then went wide-eyed as he saw us. The man immediately leapt to his feet and began striding towards the door while ranting about cowards, scavengers, and heretics. We automatically raised our weapons again, but before the ranting scout marine got much closer, the sword-bearing skeleton and nearly headless guardsman shared an exasperated look, got up, and grabbed him by the elbows. They didn't actually have the strength to stop the scout, but then the bearded skeleton came over and pulled down on the talon sticking out of the large man's back, causing him to topple backwards. The scout marine was dragged back to the table, screaming at us the whole way, mostly about his sergeant. Specifically how our incompetence had gotten him cut in half, the way we'd lost, stolen, or sold most of his gear and his legs, and how we'd finally left him, alone and dying, in a demonically tainted hole. This annoyed Doc, who thought he'd done a pretty good job keeping Gravis sort of alive, all things considered, and said so. On the list of sane things to do, arguing with a dead Scout Marine is pretty close to the bottom, but that didn't stop Doc, or Nubby, or Tink for that matter. All three of them started throwing excuses, explanations, and insults at the impaled Scout, who expanded his list of grievances to include being too cowardly to shoot down a Flyrant, abandoning a shuttle full of his battle brothers in a Xenos-filled backwater, and getting him stuck in some shitty poker room for all eternity. Nubby responded by calling his Primarch fat. The bearded skeleton, who'd been snickering at the exchange and Sarge's pained reaction to it, fell over laughing at that remark, and the argument petered out. Once he'd regained his breath, the skeleton apologized for the new guy's complete lack of perspective, and then immediately went on to congratulate us for doing something about Frank. Since he gestured towards the pallet when he said that, we assumed that he meant the Demonthrope, and didn't ask why it had a name. Sarge adopted his best poker face, thanked the skeleton for his praise, suggested that it was time we got moving again, and began to shut the door. The bearded skeleton held up a finger and suggested we take the lift all the way up to level 39. Tink, ever the pedant, pointed out that the lift only went to level 26.5, which prompted yet another bout of knee-slapping laughter from the skeleton. Acting as if we'd said the most hilarious thing he'd ever heard, the bearded skeleton repeated Tink's statement to his three companions, two of which joined in laughing. After a few seconds, the faceless guardsman gurgled something, which prompted the spokes skeleton to make a "get a load of this guy" gesture at him, and ask us if we minded. Without even thinking, Sarge responded with a shrug, then flinched backwards as the headshot corpse suddenly appeared at the doorway, and began to lean out into the lift. Talking to the familiar denizens of the poker room was one thing, but one of them coming out was quite another. Most of us raised our weapons, and Sarge tried to slam the door, but Twitch grabbed his arm and gestured at the rest of us to put the guns away and back up. The nearly headless guardsman gave Twitch an appreciative-sounding gurgle and switched an arm out towards the lift control panel. As the corpse's arm passed over the threshold, the flesh on it began to rot and bubble, and the lights on the drones and our armor began to flicker. With a crackling pop, the annoying lift music cut out and was replaced by immensely creepy children's songs, which the blood faces on the shaft's wall began singing along to. Twitch began rocking back and forth and singing along as well, and for some reason Theo joined in too. Amy told them both to stop being crazy, prompting Twitch to giggle and Theo to complain about how he was just trying to fit in, and we really needed to document what was and wasn't considered crazy in our backwards culture. When its rotting arm reached the control panel, the headshot guardsman began leaning his head out to get a look at what he was doing. We all reflexively looked away and didn't see exactly what happened next, but there was an indescribably foul smell, and a layer of frost formed on everything in the lift except for the Demonthrope's stasis unit. Then the frost and smell abruptly vanished, the singing stopped, and we looked back to see the guardsmen lumbering back into the poker room, looking as normal as anyone with a massive crater in their head can. The charred spoke skeleton laughed at us, gestured towards the button labeled 39 that had appeared at the top of the control panel, asked if that was better, and told us to have fun. Behind him, the sword-bearing skeleton paused from restraining the scout and waved, then told us not to fuck up because he had money on us. The last thing we saw before Sarge closed the door was the two skeletons levering the Scout up, and the headshot guardsman sitting down at the bar next to a vague, ghostly shape that hadn't been there earlier. We noted the absence of Doc's recently expired armsman, and unanimously agreed to never speak of him again.